Ace got arrested at the border of Mississippi and Louisiana, and that was more than just bad luck. It was the culmination of a risky, ill-timed move that set off a chain reaction he couldn't control. When he called Don on his way down to the boot, Don sensed something was off, but held back, choosing to keep his gut feeling to himself. Ace's run was too risky, but Don had other priorities. He was already en route to Charlotte, where he had a rendezvous lined up with Jaguar at Onyx's strip club. Besides, he was there to connect with an exotic marijuana mule from Miami, a player in a network tied to his friends at NASA Studios, Steve Beck and Swift. As Don hit 85 South, he put Ace's risky trip out of his mind. Meanwhile, Ace's run came to a swift halt just off a highway in a small Mississippi town when the feds swooped in, seizing him and the half-key of heroin he was transporting. The arrest should have meant jail time, but Starling was always 2 steps ahead. Unbeknownst to Ace, Starling pulled strings with a high-powered bail bondsman, securing his release and arranging for his return to North Carolina. Starling dispatched Kira, one of his most formidable enforcers, to retrieve Ace. Known for her lethal skill set and sharp intuition, Kira was loyal to Starling alone and had a reputation that preceded her. When Ace climbed into the sleek black turbo Porsche, he was greeted by Kira's steely gaze and an unmistakable tension in the air. She wasted no time, shifting gears as they sped up the highway, the engine roaring as she fixed her eyes on him with an unblinking intensity. Draped across her lap was her pistol, equipped with a silencer, a silent reminder that this was no ordinary ride home. Ace knew he was in trouble, and Kira made it clear from the moment he settled into the seat that there would be no casual conversation. Kira's interrogation began immediately, her tone direct and unyielding. She wanted to know everything: what went wrong, who tipped off the feds, and whether Ace had left any loose ends that could lead back to Starling's empire. With every question, her fingers grazed the pistol in her lap, a wordless threat that if she didn't like his answers, the drive could end very differently. Ace, rattled and realizing the danger of his situation, stammered through his explanations, doing his best to convince her that he hadn't been careless or compromised anyone important. As they tore down the highway, Kira's gaze remained fixed on the road, but her attention was fully on Ace, assessing whether he could still be trusted. For Starling, sending Kira was more than a retrieval mission, it was a test of loyalty. If Ace had crossed a line, she was prepared to silence him, leaving no traces behind. In that high-speed drive back to Carolina, with nothing but miles of highway and the low hum of the engine, Ace knew he was caught between loyalty and survival. Don's early morning visit to Onyx was a world apart from the everyday. Thanks to his connections with Ace Money Entertainment, he had the club to himself, even at 9 in the morning. As he entered, Jaguar wasted no time, greeting him with a lap dance, while her right-hand woman, Simone, poured him a glass of champagne. It was a perk of being affiliated with Ace, whose influence, through his side piece Roxanne, ensured that anyone under his banner was treated like royalty at Onyx. Don had more than leisure on his mind. He was there on business, subtly working the room with his video magazine. Strippers and models alike gravitated to the chance of being featured, willing to go the extra mile for a shot in front of the camera. Don knew how to navigate these interactions, letting his reputation and connections create opportunities without ever directly asking for them. While Don was settling in, Santos entered the scene, dressed in an all-black suit that spoke of both style and purpose, carrying a high-end designer shopping bag as if he'd just come from Louis Vuitton. 2 women greeted him, guiding him to a seat and easing him into the VIP treatment with massages and a lap dance. Santos's arrival marked the next phase of Don's plan. The bag Santos carried was discreetly placed next to Don, a handoff that required no words or cash. Everything was understood between them. With the bag in his possession, Don motioned to Jaguar, who took the cue. In a well-practiced routine, he handed her his keys to the modest 4-cylinder car he'd arrived in, and she picked up the shopping bag without a word, slipping out of the club to complete the drop. She walked to his car in the early morning light, placed the bag in the trunk, concealing the marijuana he'd come to secure, and returned just as smoothly as she'd left. The entire exchange was seamless, like a choreographed dance between all involved, a show of loyalty and trust built on unspoken understandings. Santos had come and gone in a flash, disappearing down the road toward South Carolina on his way back to Miami, where the next link in the pipeline awaited. This wasn't just any network, it was a streamlined operation, a marijuana supply line spanning New York to Miami, managed by a tight-knit group of Latinos with connections all along the East Coast. Don's involvement was new, born of necessity rather than ambition. He'd left hustling behind long ago, but the demand in North Carolina had skyrocketed, leaving a gap he couldn't ignore. As Don merged onto the highway back to Durham, the tension was thick. The thought of an arrest of Ace in Mississippi weighed on his mind, casting a shadow over the morning's transactions. The idea of Ace getting captured felt too close, too well-timed, as if someone had tipped off the feds. Don's instincts told him he was under watch, a feeling he couldn't shake as police cars appeared on the road ahead, cruising in his direction. Don kept his cool, gripping the wheel with purpose. He maintained his speed, his face blank as he passed the officers, refusing to make eye contact. Every move was calculated, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind replaying the morning's events, looking for any signs of exposure. In his rearview mirror, he tracked the patrol cars as they disappeared from sight, the tension only slightly easing. The road stretched before him, but his mind was locked on the possibility of a sting. The vibe of Ace getting arrested had rattled him, a reminder that even the best plans could unravel. For miles, he scanned the highway in silence, watching every car that approached, prepared for anything. The morning's events were too surreal to ignore. It felt like he was in the middle of a heist film, every mile bringing him closer to Durham, but no closer to peace. Each gas station he passed felt like a risk, the thought of stopping unthinkable with the police presence he'd just encountered. Don kept driving, vigilant and prepared, knowing that in this line of work, survival depended on intuition. And right now, his was telling him to keep moving, to get out clean, and to disappear from sight. At 3 a.m., Don's phone lit up in the darkness, jolting him awake. The voice on the other end was urgent. It was Big Gary, Ace's bodyguard, his voice thick with stress and adrenaline. They got bruh, he repeated, a note of disbelief in his tone. Big Gary confirmed what Don's instincts had been telling him all along. Ace's arrest in Mississippi was no random fluke, it was a targeted hit. The network was vulnerable, and the walls were closing in. Don's mind raced as he processed the news. His gut had warned him the day before, but the confirmation of Ace's arrest hit harder than he anticipated. He'd known the risks, but Ace's downfall put everything in a stark new light. If the authorities had Ace, they could have intel on the rest of the network. The tension of the previous day suddenly felt justified. Trying to keep his composure, Don replied calmly to Big Gary, telling him he'd meet him at the clubhouse in a few days. There, away from prying ears and eyes, they could discuss the fallout and figure out their next move. Hanging up, Don sat in the darkness, wide awake, his mind turning over every detail of the past few days, wondering if there was a way to secure himself and the network in the wake of Ace's arrest. Several days had passed, and Don went over to Ace's clubhouse apartment where everyone in the AME crew hung out. Don walked through the front door, hugging and dapping Ace up, saying, "I got $10,000 on me. I thought I had to break a brother out of jail." Ace laughed hard-heartedly and smiled and said, "My brother. Love you, bruh." Don didn't know the height of Ace's arrest in Mississippi, and being that Ace didn't go into detail about it, Don felt it was a slap on the wrist, although he figured it could have been serious at the same time. An arrest is an arrest, and police contact was never a good thing in the life, as far as Don was concerned. Don had long sensed that Ace was in over his head, caught up in a game he barely understood. Don and his partner Nitty were in Richmond when they heard more in detail about Ace's arrest in Mississippi from a close, reliable source. and though they were on their way to Atlanta for interviews with recording artists, the news of Ace's capture weighed on Don. Ace's ambition was unmatched, but his stubbornness made him blind to the fact that his own moves were making him a target. When Ace got out, he constantly called Don out fear. He needed his streetwise friend close to him. His desperation was palpable. He begged Don to come down from Richmond to Mississippi with him and his side piece Roxanne from Charlotte, hoping to hire a team of top attorneys to defend his innocence. Don, who had been through the ringer himself many years before, understood the stakes Ace was facing. But he knew that helping Ace would be costly, not just financially, but in terms of risk. Don kept his tone cool as he laid out his terms, letting Ace know that his involvement wouldn't come cheap. He'd find the best legal team available, but he made it clear that this wasn't just a favor, it was business. Don had been through the same pitfalls that Ace was stumbling into, and he saw Ace's predicament with clear eyes. Yet Ace, still trying to prove himself, couldn't fully acknowledge that Don's experience wasn't just from books or movies. Don had survived the very path Ace was now barreling down, but he knew Ace had to come to that realization on his own. With that understanding between them, Don began making arrangements, tapping into his connections and street smarts to set up a legal defense. In the back of his mind, though, he knew that for all the help he could provide, Ace's true enemy was his own pride. That month was nothing short of a firestorm in Raleigh-Durham. The feds launched an aggressive crackdown, sweeping through neighborhoods and combing every corner for any trace of Ace Money Entertainment's operations. Anyone connected to the network felt the heat, and the streets buzzed with rumors of arrests and raids. But Don and Nitty, far from the chaos, stayed on the road. They were focused on expanding their magazine's reach, securing video and photo shoots, and landing interviews with celebrities, keeping their distance from the fallout back home. Don had left his beat-up Lincoln parked at the I.M.S studio, close enough to the airport to avoid parking fees whenever he was on the move. The car, with its worn-out look and keys left in the ignition, was inconspicuous, just another old vehicle that no one would give a second glance. Don had made it clear to Big Gary to keep the Lincoln out of any drug business, warning him against using it as a cover for stings. But he knew how the AME boys operated. To them, the car was just another low-key ride, untraceable in their eyes and perfect for making runs without attracting attention. While Don was out of town, he had no way of knowing if they were listening or whether his Lincoln was being used for exactly what he'd warned against. With the city in the feds' crosshairs, any small slip-up could link him to the crumbling empire of Ace Money Entertainment, a risk he couldn't afford but couldn't fully control either. For now, he focused on his magazine work, hoping that distance would keep him clear of the inferno spreading back home. As Don started piecing things together, a sense of unease settled in. The more he reflected, the more certain he became that he, too, might be under the feds' radar. He'd warned Ace repeatedly to get new cell phones for the AME crew. Every time Don was on a call, strange echoes or odd clicks would break through the line, classic signs that his phone could be tapped. But Ace, mirroring Starling's reckless attitude, brushed it off, treating Don's cautions as needless paranoia. One incident in particular stood out. Just before boarding a plane to Florida, Ace had casually asked when he'd be back, and that's when the line went haywire. Strange, garbled noises that made Don's skin crawl. Frustrated, he'd yelled at Ace, urging him to change his number immediately before hanging up and heading onto the plane. It was moments like that which reinforced Don's suspicion that he wasn't just on the feds' radar, he was in the center of it. Don had always believed that if you kept moving, it was harder for anyone to pin you down. So he'd taken to staying on the road with Nitty, focusing on the magazine, and using constant travel as a shield against being cornered. He knew that surveillance was built on patterns, and by refusing to settle in one place for too long, he hoped to stay a step ahead of the eyes watching him. His theory was simple: if they couldn't catch him standing still, they'd have a harder time making a case stick. But he also knew he was playing a high-stakes game, and one misstep could bring the entire weight of the investigation crashing down on him. Don had been in and out of Miami countless times, each trip blurring into the next as he worked tirelessly on the infamous Zoe Pound documentary. This time, however, he wasn't alone. A strikingly beautiful Latina named Tina had flown back with him, a new presence that added a bit of tension to his usually smooth routine. After landing, he picked up his familiar black Lincoln, and the two of them headed straight for Sammy Carino's, the Italian spot Ace swore by. They settled in, Don twirling his fork into a heaping plate of spaghetti, trying to ease into the moment. But Tina's sudden words cut through his thoughts. "I don't know what the hell you're into," she said quietly, her eyes darting toward the parking lot. "But you're hot." Don followed her gaze. Outside, a drug task force officer was working with a sniffer dog, the pair methodically circling a car parked near his Lincoln. The dog seemed intensely focused, but on the vehicle beside his, not his own. Don's instincts kicked in, his nerves steeling as he rose from his seat. He was not one to back down, especially if the heat was pressing in close. Walking straight toward the officer, Don exuded a calm confidence. He made eye contact with the officer, giving a polite nod as he popped his trunk, reaching in as casually as if he were grabbing a sweatshirt. He knew that any hesitation could draw unwanted attention, so he moved as if he had nothing to hide. The officer glanced at him briefly, then returned to his task, focused on the car that held the dog's interest. Don's boldness paid off. He retrieved his sweatshirt, shut the trunk, and strolled back to the restaurant as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Inside, Tina's gaze followed him with a mixture of awe and disbelief. The tension in the air was thick, but Don played it cool, easing back into his seat and twirling his fork back into his plate of spaghetti, resuming their meal as if they weren't both acutely aware of the fire closing in around him. After dinner, the tension between Don and Tina was undeniable. She'd seen enough to realize that whatever Don was wrapped up in was far beyond what she'd anticipated. Though she'd joined him for a quick trip, the sight of the drug task force was a stark reminder of the danger surrounding him. And while she'd been charmed by the allure of his world, she knew she didn't belong in it. As they pulled up to the airport, Tina turned to Don, her expression a mix of concern and finality. "I can't get caught up in all this, Don," she said quietly, her voice laced with regret. He nodded, understanding that she was making the choice he'd seen coming. The risks he navigated daily were a constant balancing act for him, but for Tina, this was too much. She left without another word, disappearing into the bustling airport. As Don watched her go, he felt a pang of regret, but understood her choice. Back in his Lincoln, he took a deep breath, knowing that as much as he tried to keep his world compartmentalized, the fire around him was spreading. Nitty, sensing the storm, had already distanced himself from the chaos, retreating to Sanford to focus on his video edits. Don noted Nitty's instinct to step back, recognizing that he understood when it was time to cut ties with I.M.S, even if only temporarily. The circle was getting tighter, and the ones still around were drawn deeper into the unraveling mess. Don, alongside Chapo, found himself once again in Ace's orbit, this time trailing Ace and his Charlotte girl Roxanne down to Mississippi. Ace was desperate to find legal help, hoping to sidestep the harsh realities of what was closing in on him. But every attorney they met seemed to have the same response: cooperate with the feds. For Ace, this wasn't even an option. He wasn't cut out for prison, but he was also far from ready to turn on his own. The prospect of cooperating was out of the question, no matter how many times the lawyers subtly hinted at it. When one lawyer came highly recommended and requested a hefty upfront fee of $30,000, Ace seemed ready to pull the trigger. But Don intervened, cautioning Ace that an outright payment wouldn't look right, warning him that keeping payments gradual would be more professional and raise fewer red flags. Don's experience showed through, and reluctantly, Ace listened, sensing the wisdom in Don's advice. Ace, recognizing the value of Don's presence and guidance, paid him for his time before he and Chapo hit the road to Atlanta. Don knew that the journey was far from over, but he hoped Ace was finally seeing the tightrope he was walking. With each decision, each meeting, the stakes only climbed higher, and Don was painfully aware of how little room there was left for error. The next day, in the small, dimly lit room of a rundown recording studio on the outskirts of town, Marcus Ace Johnson was nervously pacing back and forth. His record label, Ace Money Entertainment, was well known on the streets, not for its music, but as the front for his real business. Through the glitz of local music videos, concerts, and talent showcases, Marcus had built a reputation, but those who knew the truth knew that Ace Money was the perfect cover for washing drug money. Tonight, however, he was on edge. His instincts were usually sharp, but he felt something wasn't right. Just as he considered calling it a night, he heard the faint sound of tires crunching over gravel outside. He stopped in his tracks, every muscle tense, listening as the faint hum of voices echoed in the air. It was too quiet for his usual crew. Then it hit him, the feds. The doors burst open with a force that shook the walls, and agents swarmed in with flashlights and guns drawn. Marcus stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stack of speakers, his heart racing. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he raised his hands slowly, glancing around as the room filled with men in suits and badges. "Marcus Johnson?" A voice commanded from the back of the pack. It was Special Agent Martin, a name whispered among the underworld as the one who never missed. Marcus swallowed hard, trying to maintain his usual calm exterior. "What's this about?" He tried to sound casual, but his voice wavered. Agent Martin stepped forward, holding up a small baggie. Inside was a tiny amount of white powder. "We know exactly what you're about," he said coldly, then nodded to one of his men. The agent started tearing through the studio, flipping couches, prying open floorboards, and searching every inch. Marcus stood there, his breath shallow, as he watched them uncover his secrets piece by piece. They eventually found the hidden compartment under his mixing board, a kilo of heroin stashed beneath layers of fake paperwork. "You got anything to say, Ace?" Martin taunted as Marcus's face turned pale. He bit back his panic, struggling to think of something to get him out of this, but he knew it was pointless. Instead, he stared Martin down, refusing to let him see his fear. The agents cuffed him and led him out into the cold night. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors on him as they pushed him into the back of a waiting SUV. The ride to the station was silent, save for the steady hum of the engine. Marcus kept his gaze fixed on his reflection in the window, his mind racing. He had connections, deep ones, and his only hope was that one of them would come through. The Ace Money Entertainment Studio had always been a safe haven, a place where the crew gathered to talk business, make music, and plan their next moves. But that morning, it was anything but safe. Unbeknownst to them, the feds had set up a trap, turning the studio into a scene out of a nightmare. As each member of the crew arrived, they walked straight into the ambush. Otis, Ace's younger brother, was one of the first to arrive. He slipped his key into the door, only to find it already unlocked. As he pushed it open, a hand shot out, grabbing him and pulling him inside. Before he could react, a federal agent slammed him against the wall, cuffing him and dragging him to the floor. There, he found himself beside Big Gary, who was already cuffed and seated against the wall, his eyes betraying a sense of quiet resignation. One by one, the rest of the crew entered, each one meeting the same fate. Agents were everywhere, stationed behind equipment, crouched behind soundproof panels, their guns drawn and expressions cold. They'd set up this operation meticulously, knowing that Ace Money Entertainment members would arrive early, unsuspecting, thinking the studio was just another day's destination. As the minutes dragged on, Otis looked around the room, taking in the faces of his fellow crew members as they were each pulled in, one by one, and handcuffed beside him. The familiar space was now a trap, an eerie silence hanging over what was usually a buzzing, creative environment. There was a sense of betrayal in the air, as if the walls themselves had conspired to bring them down. The studio had been a sanctuary, but now it was the place where their empire began to fall. Don's intuition had saved him more times than he could count, and today was no different. Constantly remembering the early morning call from Big Gary, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that stepping into that studio wasn't just risky, it was a mistake. So, instead of heading over to the studio in Ace's clubhouse frequently as usual, he kept his distance, choosing caution over loyalty. He didn't know it yet, but this choice would be the difference between freedom and a life in chains. Back at the studio, the feds had executed their operation perfectly, rounding up every member of Ace Money Entertainment in a single sweep. Had Don walked through those doors, he would have been another name on their list, another cog in the wheel of their investigation. But by staying back, he unwittingly dodged a bullet that could have unraveled his entire life. As he pieced together the events later, Don realized just how close he'd come to losing everything. The feds had laid a trap for Ace's entire network, and with everyone arrested in one sweep, the empire they'd all built was on the brink of collapse. Don's absence at the studio kept him in the shadows, a ghost to the feds who were after his connections. And while his instincts had always been sharp, this time they had granted him something invaluable, a second chance. To be continued.